Because your books don't say a lot, right, about people? You want me to abbreviate this, in other words? Okay. Okay, my name is Linda Smith, and I came to Austin in 1968 to go to graduate school in anthropology after being in Ecuador for 2.5 years. And I stayed in that, I started to read the rag, and I got so fascinated with the content of what was in the rag, and so disenchanted with the content that was in my anthro program, which was mostly old male theory, and I phased out of my anthro program and into working on the rag. And I became the office coordinator for the rag. And then I was involved with the early women's liberation movement here in Austin, and I have a very powerful memory of spending a lot of time in each other's backyards, talking about our lives, growing up female, and consciousness raising. And although, the rag was very important to me, participating in the women's movement was life-changing.
Your book. So it has these little quick things like most loved and most hated. That would probably be mine. You want more? And now what they would say about me? Well, I'll tell you, it's a little weird having all of this about some activity that we did just because it was important to our lives to do. So I have become a historic figure. I've become significant in a way that wasn't something I was looking to do at all. So right now I would say if the yearbook were published, they'd say someone who made a difference. Oh, sorry, yes, Judy Smith. I moved here after I was in the Peace Corps in Africa. And I was in San Francisco shutting down the Oakland Draft Center a little before.
My name is Barbara Hines, and I came to UT in 1965 to go to college here. I left, I came back, I was in Europe, and I became very politicized when I came back. And I think what's important to think about is the times. Because although I think what we did was very significant, there was a lot of political activity and a lot of political change going on at that time. I was taking a class which I think was called Marxism and Philosophy, taught by Larry Caroline, who was subsequently expelled from the university because he spoke at an anti-war demonstration. And it was there that someone invited me to go to the RAG and to go to a women's liberation meeting. And I went to my first women's liberation meeting in April of 1969. And from there, the women's movement, much more so than the RAG, really took over my life. And that's really what I did for about 3 years of my life. That's what I remember. I think it was one of the most significant things that I ever did. And from there, I went to law school to do women's rights law. I ended up not really doing women's rights law, although I did work for Sarah as a law student. I ended up being an immigration lawyer. But I think really what the women's movement did was give me the confidence to realize that I could do what I wanted to do and realize my dreams.
My name is Victoria Foe. I came to Austin earlier than anyone here. I came in 1963, the year of the Kennedy assassination. I actually came from England at the time, though I was American. I came as an undergraduate, and I think I slowly woke up during the next 5 years. I didn't come politicized. I was a very serious, quiet, hardworking student who took everything around me very seriously and really looked more deeply than perhaps some of my peers at what were the origins of some of the injustices I saw around me. I was a student first in zoology, and a very seminal date for me was in November of '69 when Judy Smith, I entered graduate school here too, and Judy Smith came to the lab when I was also a graduate student, and she invited me to a meeting in her house where women were going to get together and just talk about the problems that women shared. And it was very clear to me then already that if you wanted to do something important in the world, the really primary thing you needed to do as a woman was to be able to control your reproductive choices. Otherwise, everything was cut off, and that was already very clear. And then the seed in development was very high expectations on my father's part. He believed that his oldest daughter should be able to achieve anything that a man could, and the contradiction between being able to aspire highly and not decide when and if you're going to have a child was just glaring to me. So that was kind of the scene, I guess. That was an war which was just on everybody's mind.
So I took you literally about the yearbook, so I'll return since everyone else seemed to add. I came to Austin, as I said, after I'd been in San Francisco and Oakland working on the anti-war movement there. I had been in the Peace Corps, and I was part of the set in the Peace Corps that were basically political people that had been recruited from campuses. The Peace Corps was trying us out to see if they could tolerate us. And I had been active in the civil rights movement and a variety of things when I was on campus. So interestingly, when I was in the Peace Corps, one of the things that we heard about, because all of a sudden we were in the world instead of here, was a different view of the Vietnam War and our political policy in Africa and other places. So an experience, to use the language, an experience with imperialism, because oil in Nigeria is where I was a perfect example of white people coming somewhere and taking all the benefit out and black people paying all the price. Well, we couldn't ignore that because we were already political people. So I was a very politicized person by the time I came here. And I came because San Francisco at that time became too much for me. It was a war zone. And I realized that although I learned how to put the shield on and hit the tear gas back and wear masks and do the whole thing, that wasn't the way that it was going to be different for me. So my sister Lynn sent me some copies of The Rag and said, you know what, people are actually doing some interesting things in Texas, because that was hard for me to believe, having gone to high school in Dallas. So I returned and just checked the scene out here. And the first part of the scene that I checked out was The Rag, because to me, I've always been very committed to the idea that if we could get the alternative view out to people, we could connect. But as long as they don't hear that, and it's all forms of media in my opinion, but at that time it was the print media. If they can't hear that, then there's no connection. So anyway, I came into The Rag, and always being a person who just did what they were going to do, we just began to say, okay, The Rag's going to be this. And at that time, around the country, not just here, women began to gather. And we began to hear about that at The Rag as well, because of the Liberation News Service and some of the other connections. And I think that's the other thing about that time that other folks have reflected a little bit too. I didn't feel a part of a little thing here in Austin. I felt part of this whole national attempt at revolution, whatever that meant. So.
Help paint the picture of what women faced on campus in Austin at that time. What was the landscape like? What kind of restrictions, what kind of oppression, what was life like? What were the things that really got under your skin being in Austin at that time?
Well, there was so much, so it's hard to know where to begin. But I think from our perspective, one of the things was lack of access to birth control. I mean, there were many things. There were ideas about if you came to college, you could be a teacher, or you could be a nurse. You certainly couldn't be a doctor. Very, very few women were going to law school. So I think one of the things was the role model issue. Women as sex symbols. I think about this now because I think about what women in this generation would probably think, but some of the things that we did in our women's liberation group was that we protested the Miss America contest because we thought that made women sex symbols. We did a lot of guerrilla theater, and we protested auctions off of women that sororities and fraternities were doing. And this may seem insignificant, but no one had really ever heard about women's rights here. And one of the things that Judy and I were remembering about, and maybe this is not exactly your question, things were very oppressive. No one was thinking about women's rights, period. And so a lot of what we were doing in the beginning was an education campaign. And we were going around, going to classes, talking to women and men in their classes about women's rights. But I think when we're looking at the abortion issue, The first issue was that you couldn't get birth control pills at the Student Health Center, and there were very few doctors that would even allow women to get birth control out of their private practices.
About the health center, when we first started, we'll hear much more about this later, sort of compiling resources for women pertaining to birth control, we were also making lists of doctors who groped women and who said very demeaning things to women who came asking for help with birth control, as if that immediately branded them as some sort of whore that you could then reach out and feel. And, I remember taking names of doctors and complaints when we did that. I lived in a off-campus dorm, and there were a huge number of women who came there from all over Texas, basically flunked out by the end of the second semester. They came basically to find husbands. It was also an area that was a recruiting ground. I remember everyone was very excited that Playboy came to look over those really beautiful co-eds, and the airline companies to look for stewardesses. They came and they sat down in the foyer and sort of looked at people coming through, and then they sent out where we would like to interview these people, and that was very exciting. We might be able to be a stewardess because she's exceptionally cute. And Playboy did exactly the same.
So Vic and I can tell the story maybe in tandem because we were part of a graduate program where there were no women faculty. And I happened to be in the elevator one time with one of the faculty, and we had started agitating them a little bit around this, and they had told me that they had hired one, and it was about 20 years ago, and she didn't work out. And that was a serious conversation that we had with someone like myself, who was there as a PhD student and was doing work that certainly would have been equivalent to other people in the lab's work. For myself, one of the things that I very consciously did is find a lab that at least had an ally, and also the professor actually was, supportive. And later, what was so fascinating, I was at a gathering at his house, and his wife came to me and gave me a little pin that her grandmother had given her, because her grandmother had been a suffrage person who'd been locked up. And so she had this little pin of bars and a woman standing behind bars. This was years into this relationship where I'm sure love-hate relationship, where I'm sure my professor tore his hair out because I was rarely in the lab. I was out doing something. And his wife, though, just really felt that we were part of this tradition. And that's something that I find so interesting about looking back at Texas, because it was really hard here. But we were able to do what we did. I mean, we defaced pictures around, this insults women. I mean, we were very pushing it. And we went into fraternities. We did, there was no ground we didn't go into. And personally, I'll speak for myself, I didn't feel violence from that. I didn't worry that someone was going to beat me up. They would call me names. But there was not that threat of violence, which actually I think is more prevalent now than at that time. So I'll just reflect that back, that I know that people weren't happy with us, but I didn't feel scared about that particular thing. But I don't know, others may feel different.
We were really challenging a lot of the expectations for women's behavior and dress, and we would give these presentations like to a bunch of guys in a dorm. We did wear skirts, but we didn't shave our legs, and we were wearing desert boots. We were just doing what we wanted to do to try to break out of the expectations, the confining of how you're supposed to dress and act. And actually, a lot of those young guys we were trying to explain, some of the basic, important issues in women's liberation and why we felt that way. And they were very attentive. And I agree that I didn't feel any threat of violence. And I know on campus, I was here as a graduate student and I was only here for a year, but I do recall being on a campus of 40,000 students, but because I was in my department, I could kind of cope with the scale of it. But I remember there were huge demonstrations in the streets in support of women's rights to make their own reproductive choices and against the war. And I remember when, I think it was the Gulf of Tonkin decision was made, students just poured out of class and just had, rallied on the common spaces out here and speaker after speaker. And, it was just that there were so many other things going on in our lives besides school.
I want to bring it back just a little bit to continue something else that Judy said about professional expectations in the zoology department. In our lab, there was a woman who, I guess you'd say she was a lab technician. She must have been 35, 40,
40.
or something like that. I think she went on to be dean or something. But after we'd been there a while, she sort of took me aside and said, things are really beginning to change for women. She said, when I went to school, I wasn't allowed to sit in a lecture. I had to sit behind some sort of screen so that I wouldn't be seen. And I wasn't allowed to actually take a lab. I could listen to the lectures, but I was prohibited to participate in lab because it seemed that lifting things or participating in, I can't remember what it was, she had to move around bottles or something, was something women shouldn't do because it put them at risk for, they were fragile because they were to be mothers and they simply weren't allowed to participate. Another professor who was influential because of the field I went into in our department took me aside one day and I was completely surprised and just came completely out of the blue, and he says, I want to tell you that you've really got to be very strong here. And I think he meant it well, but it was really took me back. He said you would have to work twice as hard and expect to be paid half as much. And women are just considered a bad risk because they'll get pregnant and leave. And you've got to really be more serious than any of the men students here if you want to actually do biology. And I found out later, which I hadn't known, is that he had a wife, I think they were divorced then, who was a very accomplished biologist and who never could get a job. And so he was warning me off. You may know more about the story. This is Jacobson.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I was going to actually just transition. There's a ally of ours, B. Durden, who isn't here, who came here as a Yale graduate, PhD, and could never get a job. And her husband came and got a job right away. The one I was going to mention, and this gets into the sort of subtleties of things that I think a lot of us have tried to work now and push through, was when I was in my dissertation defense committee, one of the professors who I actually liked pretty well came in, and I used to have very long hair, and patted my hair and said, you have such beautiful hair. And that was the first thing that happened when I was supposed to defend my dissertation. Well, again, fortunately it was me, but imagine how undermining, although he would have told me that wasn't meant to be undermining, I don't believe that at all. That was totally removing my capacity and taking it to a level where it could become he was dominant. So to me, that was the professional side. The other part about the environment Lynn really mentioned, I always tell younger people now, that time I was so lucky to be alive then. There was incredible energy, even here in Austin. I shouldn't say even here. Austin was one of the spots where there was incredible energy around all kinds of things. I mean, again, I was laughingly telling Barbara a story, and I will just briefly mention this. We actually thought there could be a revolution, ha ha ha. So, we were very serious about things, and we felt the rest of the country was rising up with us. And working at the RAG, those kind of connections with LNS and, the national conferences we would go to, I think we had every reason. That wasn't, delusionary. It just wasn't sophisticated.
Help me understand, coming from San Francisco, Peace Corps work and everything that y'all have done, it feels as though the seeds, the genesis of this started in other parts of the country and kind of coalesced here for a lot of, particularly reproductive rights for contraception, for empowering women. Help me understand how that all came together here. What was the magic that made it happen? What was it? The personalities? Was it the RAG? Was it other publications? What was it that really?
Well, I think one of the things that we talked about yesterday, as I told you when we were reconstructing the collective memory, is that I think it just happened here by almost serendipity or chance, because what was going, and that's not to say it wasn't really significant and it made such an amazing change, and I'm so proud to have been part of it. But this was going on all over the country. So people were talking about abortion laws, people were talking about birth control, we were going to national conferences. And so really, we were just really part of an entire movement. It's not that women's liberation started here. It's not really that people were thinking about abortion laws and how to challenge them. This was really going on in the entire country. And I guess one of the differences here is other states were beginning to liberalize their laws and Texas wasn't. So when we started working on this, it was a felony to have an abortion and it was a felony to assist people in getting abortion. So that might have made Texas different, but it wasn't really that we were alone in this issue. There were numerous other states, but really this was a conversation that was going on across the country, and that's why I think it was so energizing, and that's why I think we had the idea that we were going to be able to make a difference. It was not just our women's liberation group in Austin, Texas. It was a national movement of women.
So a couple of things I think that were unique and specific to Austin, though it's true, fire was in the wind, and there was this enormous spirit and feeling around the country. The two things that were specific to Austin was sort of a cultural oasis in the middle of a state which, I don't know whether I should say repressive, but people came from Lubbock, they came from, all ends to get away from their high schools. They came with dreams, they came with hopes. And so it created this community that was absolutely unique and primed and had complaints from local communities all around. Because they were sexual minorities, or they were poor, or they were women who aspired to more, or they were misfits of various sorts with big dreams. The second thing I think that was unique here is the connection to the war was really visible to us. Lyndon Johnson was the president, he was connected to Connally, although he was Irwin. I mean, we could see all up and down this really solid chain of command who controlled the country, who controlled the state, who controlled the university, who made very repressive laws, that we use here at home. And so it was a wonderful learning platform. It was not abstract, it was real obvious.
I can underscore a little bit what Vic said. Someone down the way in the lab was doing biological warfare research. And no one was like, hi, what's your project? And we did a part of that analysis of looking at the university itself as a war machine, and the RAG actually published some of that research. So the thing I think is, though, I really want to mention is, having gone to high school in Texas, if I was going to live anywhere in Texas, it would have been here. And I think in some ways, a lot of us are kind of proud, as at least somewhat identified as Texans, that Austin at that time got us. We were Texans. We came here. This was the place. I didn't want to go to school here particularly, but as I say, if there was going to be any place in Texas I was going to go, it was going to be here. And as Vic said, everybody came here because if you were going to be different at all in high school in Texas, which actually, that was pretty easy to do, then you were going to be here. So it was almost like critical mass from Texans. It wasn't, so when you said from outside, I'm a Texan. I went to school here in high school. I learned my way the hard way. So I didn't see it as outside, and that was one of the big fights that we had in this very building, is those of us that worked at the RAG across the street, we weren't foreigners, we weren't invading. This is, we were all connected to the community that was right here. And so that idea that non-students were running something, most of us that I knew were students or had been students and were from Texas, and we wanted to make the change here, so we were committed.
Well, my experience was somewhat different in the sense that I didn't really go to school here in Texas other than that year at the university and graduate school. But I remember feeling the connection through the free press movement in the 60s, which was huge in terms of, as Jude mentioned, the Liberation News Service, but the cooperative agreements that everybody exchanged everything, whether it was articles or pictures, and that the sort of free exchange of ideas and visuals and all this kind of thing, that we weren't copywriting everything and saying you've got to pay for this, or it was just a totally different experience of the expression of ideas that weren't in the mainstream press. And the rag really was the outlet for a lot of this, as well as this other publications that were coming.
Help me understand the landscape for women's reproductive rights. Kind of touched on it, but what was reality back in those days? What did women face? You mentioned the student health center and the doctors and the counseling. Help me understand what you faced. There were not very many safe harbors in those days for information.
Well, I can say a few things. This was before we really even had a family planning, Planned Parenthood presence much at all. And so for us, one of the things that we did is we took little ads out. And here's an example of the environment. I was laughing because I was reading it. It said magic numbers, and my number wasn't in there for birth control information. But we used to get a week, we would get easily 30, 40 calls from women looking for something. So that's the environment that women absolutely, and it wasn't just students. At first it started out mostly students, but then it became much more than that around the Austin community. So not only was there not like institutions that were actually set up and delivering service, which is the place we wanted to get, but there wasn't even information around about where to go or what to do. And so us just popping up as this group that said, we will give you information, that became this huge magnet, this sort of flood came to us. And people didn't even think we had services. I mean, we weren't a clinic. We were just this little room that was going to give out information. So to me, that's a way of judging the environment.
I mean, and you remember in the birth control revolution, the pill became commercially available in 63, 64. So, this was really right after that. So, and as Judy said, people didn't really have any information and wanted it about the efficacy of various alternative methods of birth control. It just, the information was not out there. So we compiled lists, we talked, we were on panels, and most of that was just, at least it started as just conveying what is possible and who will give you this information and who will actually give you prescriptions.
What other kinds of support system was there for what you were wanting to do as far as presenting information? What kind of older support group, mentors?
Remember, we were the generation that didn't trust anybody over 30. So I can't remember any mentors that we probably had. Maybe B was older than we were. But I mean, this really was, the youth revolution. So what I think really is that we created our own support system. We did these consciousness raising groups. And, I think a lot of this language is very, what you were saying, very foreign to the new generation. But we would just get together and we would hold these things that we called rap sessions. And we were looking at our women's papers, 3 times a week. We would just talk to women about issues, about things that women, and one of us would lead them, and then we would try to get women to set up their own groups where they were just beginning to talk about these things. So I feel that we really created a lot of our own support system. But what I might mention, but what out of what Vic said is, or what Judy was saying, is that the next thing that we really did was we actually opened up, we had a little room, which was called the Birth Control Information and Counseling Center, and that's really where we started giving women more information.
Well, here's a little side answer to that question. For whatever reason, 3 of us were PhD students, or 2 of us were PhD students, and 1 of us had a PhD in the biological side of things. So we were the ones who felt pretty confident. We could talk about, rather complex birth control procedure and method, and we could go and look at clinics and say, this is safe or isn't safe. So we weren't perhaps what some other groups were, because we were actually on a campus and we actually had quite a bit of advanced knowledge. And The other thing I wanted to mention is there was something called the McGill Birth Control Handbook, which was a lovely thing because these folks at McGill University put together a very well done, well researched, very cheap, in fact free to some degree, publication that we could distribute. So it was kind of state of the art. And then our bodies are